got every kind of blues, but red man's got red blues. Go to work.
Sego, I am John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for joining me here on this weekly program where I address issues that affect us all from a Native perspective and sometimes tackle specific Native issues that you may or may not be aware of. So that's what we do here, and I am so grateful to be on WBAI in New York City and on WPFW in Washington, D.C. So, as I usually do, let me start this program with a plug for those two stations. We are listener-supported radio. We aren't just public radio. We aren't just community radio. We are your radio station, so we count on your contributions. So if you're listening in New York City on WBAI, I ask that you go to the pledge line and make a contribution. That pledge line is 212-209-2950. That's 212-209-2950, or you can go online at give2wbai.org. You can make a one-time donation, or you can make a time donation, or you can do something on a monthly basis by putting a charge on your card or your checking account on a monthly basis. If it's $10 or $20 a month, whatever that may be, it helps us manage the costs of operating this radio station. If you're in Washington, D.C., and you're listening to us on WPFW Jazz and Justice Radio, I ask that you go to their pledge line, which is 202-588-9739. That's 202-588-9739. Or go online to WPFWDC.org/donate. And the same thing, make a one-time donation, make a time donation, or become a sustaining member of the station by making a monthly donation off your credit card or your checking account. We greatly appreciate it. I get none of the funding. This goes solely to the radio station, so I always feel like I gotta clarify that. I'm not asking you to support me. I'm asking you to support the platform that I'm on. Of course, we also take this program, we put it up as a podcast, and you can find that by searching on your smart speaker or on your computer. Resistance Radio with John Kane podcast, and you can find this program. Look, I call the show Resistance Radio, and part of the whole thing is that just existing as Native people in a dominant culture that does not necessarily embrace our existence is resistance all by itself, and that becomes obvious in any number of ways, whether we're fighting about being exploited for mascots, or whether our hunting and fishing is violated, or whether we're trying to protect the very essence of our ancestry, which is our graves and our burial grounds. So I've got joining me this week, I've got I'm not calling I'm not calling him old, but he's an old friend. I've got joining me this week Harry Wallace from Puspatuck. He's been at this. Look, as long as I've been involved with things, I've seen Harry out there on the front lines. In fact, I think the last time I had you on my show, we were talking about eel fishing or eel. You were having a fight with New York State DEC, I think, over eel. So. I guess we could start by saying, how did that turn out?
It's still ongoing.
That's incredible.
John, Guy was saying, "Nina tasui still pas na cha shayawan Unkechaug skitong medei Nina chapayo Puspatuck natap." So greetings, my friend, and I say that because you are, and it's been doing this for a long time, and. I'm Harry Wallace. You were saying in me in my language, which means hunter man, the Turtle Clan, and I'm the elected chief of the Unkechaug Nation. And I'm really glad to be on your show today. And to answer your question about the eel fishing situation, or fishing, and I was also dealing with clams, as well as harvesting clamshell for wampum, for the manufacture of wampum purposes, as part of our tradition, which the state of New York, the DEC in particular, has objected to the way that we do those things. And as you know, that is a very significant cultural and spiritual activity that we've been doing for many thousands of years. That case is still pending in the Eastern District of New York, Federal District Court. There's motion for summary judgment pending, and I believe we're waiting for a decision by the judge in that case. And so we're confident that we will overcome these objections, that these unreasonable restrictions that have been placed upon us in our activities. It's
Well, and
something
I have
we've
to say,
always.
as a Mohawk or Unkechaug, part of the Haudenosaunee, we have counted on our brothers, especially from Long Island and sisters, for as a source of wampum. You know, we strung beads or shells from lakes here for centuries or thousands of years as well. But the refined wampum that now we've had these incredible wampum belts created for hundreds and hundreds of years. That wampum has come from essentially from you. It's come from your people. We don't have clamshells here in Seneca territory, nor do we have it in Mohawk territory. So the especially the dramatic colors that come from the purple and the white shells that you guys have. Oftentimes, I think people don't understand that while we are more sophisticated today in how we manufacture, this the those wampum beads have not changed a whole lot in the thousands of years that you guys have been doing this stuff. So it's important that not only that you maintain some of that not just that cultural identity, but that activity, whether it's the clams or whether it's eel, which is again a big part of what has been your culture for thousands of years. It's really important that you have and this is an opportunity given to you, not by at least not by New York State, create by creation, sure, but not by. In fact, if we want to talk about seeking approval from a higher power, we're talking about the powers of creation. We're not talking about Kathy Hochul or Letitia James. I don't think that those are the folks that we should be held accountable to when it comes to maintaining or sustaining ourselves in some of these cultural practices.
Well, as you know, we've always said that we don't talk about rights, we talk about responsibilities and obligations. And we have that obligation to maintain this tradition because it's part of our spiritual knowledge, it's part of our spiritual well-being. And so when we are, and I'm a Medewan man, and in our way, Medewan means the way of the heart. And what it means is that when we practice these traditions, that means that we have to participate in the way that we've been taught to do. Now, whether we use whalebone drills or we use diamond tip drills, the essence of what is being done has not changed, and it will never change. The shell, we believe, is alive. We believe it's part of our being. We, the Unkechaug and Algonquin-speaking people, like the Haudenosaunee and the Iroquois-speaking people, are people of the shell. We carry that shell with us because it represents our spiritual health. And so the whole part of it is, and the same thing with the eels, the way our tradition tells us that the color comes from that, what they call a little sea worm, that eel that comes in and carries that medicine to the soil, to the land, and the shell picks it up. So there is a relationship between the eel and the clamshell, the saltwater clamshell, that connects to that color, that dramatic color that can only be found really in the Northeast United States and in our territory. We are well known for the darkest of the shell being almost to the point of it being black and not a color of purple.
Well,
So
and the colors of these beads, these wampum, are significant in how we use them in everything from essentially mnemonic devices for recording our history, but in carrying messages, whether it's we talk about
absolutely,
runners carrying wampums for request a meeting, or whether it's frankly putting people on trial for essentially within our culture. We've used the black wampum, as we say, as a significant message that we use. Which, I mean, I don't need to elaborate too much on all of that for on this program, but that range of color that you guys have been able to produce, and I have to say, the fact that you are using more sophisticated tools today than we had available in hundreds of years ago should not be frowned upon because if anything, it's a more efficient. There's less waste. You guys are
Absolutely.
able to, and it's not about necessarily the uniformity. That doesn't concern most of us. But the idea that, I mean, I've seen the old ways of producing wampum, and I see the piles of it laying on the ground. The stuff that doesn't, 'cause trying to drill a hole through a shell is not an easy thing to do in the first
It's
place.
not an easy thing to do.
But you guys have developed that skill set even with more modern tools. So frankly, there's less waste. There's much more efficiency, and and I'm glad you guys are doing it. We all still rely heavily on the wampum that is produced by your folks down there.
And we understand that, and we appreciate that, and we know that to continue to do this is to keep it in our possession and our ability to manufacture so that we can trade with each other in the way that we've always done. So this is a vision that we established this going back. We've never stopped, but we've been able to reestablish the trade um, routes that we've maintained throughout history, and I'm really proud of being a part of that.
Well,
That's
and I think the idea
one of the things that we
that
enjoy.
we had these kinds of commercial activities is something that most never learn about as they learn any of our history. And most of that history is written by white people, so they leave they leave out an awful lot of who we are and what really defines us. But clearly, wampum is one of the things that not just it doesn't just define us and you; it binds us because it's one of the things that connects us. But
I'll tell you,
oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
let me just tell you a real short story about that. Is that back in 1995, and I've always said that there's no reason for us not to continue treaty making practices amongst our own,
Mhm.
because we should not discontinue them.
Right.
So back in 1995, we entered into a trade agreement with the Passamaquoddy in Maine. We didn't know where that would take us, but it ultimately took us to a point where we traded in wampum and in fish. And it is part of this litigation that we're in that we've established the fact, and the judge is going to rule on it, that nothing in our history prevented us from engaging in treaty making practices amongst our own people, amongst ourselves, not just us, our own people, but with Iroquois people, with other Algonquin speaking people. And that's part of the litigation, that we've engaged in this treaty practice and used the wampum as a representation of the treaty making abilities that we continue to maintain, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and again, I think the state and the federal government would like to somehow pigeonhole us into what they define as hunting and fishing rights and ignore the rest of whatever commercial activity that we were ever engaged in. And I think, frankly, I think tobacco is another example of that. We
Sure.
entered into by any definition what has to be considered a significant native to native trade as we moved away from the so-called premium brands of the United States and moved towards native brands. So that's always been part of our argument, and it's always been part of our history and our legacy. So I think that commerce, and I agree with you, those trade relationships, native to native trade relationships, are really, really significant. And frankly, I think that's still an area for significant growth between us. And I think that's something we have to figure out, how we do this yeah, in a more broad way. Because, I know it's real easy for people to come up with the dollars and cents reasons for doing something, but we know that a lot of this it goes well beyond dollars and cents, especially in such a dramatically changing environment that we live in, relating to everything from climate change to the political climate to the overt racism that we see, all over, and the global conflict, frankly. So we this is the stuff that has to bind us together so we can stand stronger as a group, even as distinct as we may be. This is and look, Harry, I remember walking on the steps of the Capitol, fighting the tobacco fight with you. what was it back? That was the 80s or something like that. I mean, it goes back a long
Now,
time.
I don't
So
want to talk about when that was, but it was a long time
it was
ago.
a long time ago. So no, I mean, this is the stuff that's really important. And I think part of what that part of what I try to communicate to the listening audience here is that this isn't just about us fighting some one wing of the United States or the state government. It doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat sitting in those offices.
I
We
agree.
we still find ourselves in a situation where we're defending our existence. We're defending our autonomy and our distinction. We've seen this with Letitia James. Even some of
Mm.
her actions against the Shinnecock over them posting a sign on their own, a monument on their own territory, and of course it does and again, I'm not picking on Democrats because I somehow favor the Republicans. I'm not saying that whatsoever, but the assumption that people make is that somehow the Democrats are a kinder and gentler um, uh, group of people that for us to deal with, and yet we see some overtly racist activity that comes from both parties, and look, and I don't care if people of color like Letitia James it becomes in a position of power or not. They're still carrying water for the white majority, and that's who we're fighting. I mean, Letitia James wasn't fighting the Shinnecock, because what they were doing offended black people. It was because of the rich white people in the Hamptons that she was basically catering to, and so I say this because I know that I've been pretty rough on Kathy Hochul, and I will continue to hold her or anybody else that sits in that position accountable, just as I would the president of the United States or a senator or anybody. And so, as much as I, I know this conversation is going to take us, to Kathy Hochul here. I don't want anything that I'm saying to be interpreted as a plug for Lee Zeldin, because I'm more concerned about some of the racism that sits on that side of that political spectrum as well. So, but let's get right into it. There is a piece of legislation that has been introduced to at the state level for better protection on our traditional burial sites. Why don't you give an overview on where that is and how it came to be and that kind of stuff?
Well, thanks a lot, John. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on your show and talk to you about this because we're at a crossroads at this point, and we need to be aware of how important this moment is in history for New York. Right now, there is a bill that has passed both houses of the New York State Legislature, the Senate and the Assembly, and they passed unanimously. It's called the Unmarked Burial Site Protection Act. And essentially, New York is one of 3 states that does not have protections against uh, burials that are on private land that are inadvertently discovered, whether it be through a construction activity, whether it be through exposure by the elements. For whatever reason, they are unearthed inadvertently. And as a consequence of New York's failure to enact legislation, the private homeowner or the private landowner or the private developer can essentially do whatever they please with these remains and funerary objects. And this legislation attempts to fill in or plug that hole in the protection against unmarked burials that exists in New York. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is a federal law that does protect unmarked burials and funerary objects, human remains, on federal land and on Indian reservation land. And it also controls those institutions that receive federal funds. But those institutions that don't receive federal funds and those institutions and those privately held lands were not covered under NAGPRA.
Well,
This,
and
as
I'm
a
glad
concept,
you explained that because I think many people are familiar with the federal statute, but not realizing the gaping hole that is left because of private land ownership. And it must be noted that look, we've had our graves looted for hundreds and hundreds of years, literally.
correct,
And I mean, the
correct.
very museum that sits in New York City and at the bottom of Manhattan there, which is a part of the Smithsonian, um, that the namesake of that museum is the collector who was basically buying this stuff up all over the place, and and so there were people
Gustav
that were
Hay,
they were
correct.
they were looting grave sites, they were looting burial grounds to give this guy his own personal collection, and that ultimately is turned into this museum, and there we can there are some processes for us to address some of the very items and artifacts that sit in these museums. But in these situations that you're talking about, there are still, I- and I'm not saying that people are necessarily disturbing the sites to loot our graves, but the fact is, their findings, you know, neither stop them from their development nor do they pursue any effort to repatriate the remains or any of the funerary items as you mentioned. So it is really important that people understand the significance of this, and this has led to a couple of conflicts that come to mind right now, recently, hasn't it?
It's led to a number of different conflicts. We've had some conflicts with some developers who are trying to develop golf courses. We've had some private landowners who found a mass burial site on their property and wanted to build a horse barn over top. We've had, we have some, and it's not necessarily just Native American remains. Up in up by Lake George, they uncovered a burial site that contained hundreds of bodies of Revolutionary War veterans that were buried there, that were buried in a mass grave because they were exposed to disease and they wanted to not have the disease spread, so they buried them in this mass burial. And the developer um, uh, dug up these bodies and just used a massive backhoe and he just ripped into this burial site, and only gave the archaeologists from New York State 2 days in which to excavate and remove any human remains. There were hundreds of bodies there. These weren't even Native Americans. These were veterans from the Revolutionary War that fought on the side of the colonies.
Well, and
So
of course, we're also still very much in the beginning of the debate over the mass and unmarked graves of children that were who died at residential schools, and and that's a national and both a U.S. and Canadian issue. But right now the idea of these mass graves and unmarked graves is something that is also, for all intents and purposes, sometimes a crime scene. And while there may not be many of them in New York, there may be, and so this is why having some of this, um, I guess this thing pushed through. And the other thing I have to say, the idea that the legislature pushed this through and voted both houses voted it through is pretty remarkable because we are not very high on the priority list for legislators in New York State. The fact that this thing was introduced and pushed through without opposition, it just shows you what a no-brainer a signature from the governor should be on this thing. And yet, how long has this thing sat before her without a signature? Do you know?
well, it was passed in May, and and the way I understand it, all the bills that were passed by the legislature, the governor has to call them to her desk, and she calls them at, I don't know, something like 20 or 25 at a time, and she deals with them piecemeal. She hasn't called, as of this date, to my knowledge, she hasn't called for this legislation yet.
Hmm.
Okay, and I don't think she's going to call for it before November 8th. I don't think she's going to call for anything before November 8th.
Yeah, she's fighting for her
So,
political life, but
yeah,
but again, this essentially is, and I say no brainer, but there's no controversy here. You know, I don't think there's a. I mean, do you suspect that there's some major lobbying effort that's keeping this off of her desk, or is it just
well, there
plain?
is opposition.
Well, I'm
There is
sure there is
opposition.
opposition, but is there enough political will with that opposition? Do you think that she's ceding to that opposition?
While there are developers who oppose this legislation, and the developers, as you know, were major contributors to Mario Cuomo's um, campaigns, and he would never sign this legislation. That
Andrew Cuomo as well.
I mean,
Oh,
Andrew
Andrew, yeah,
Cuomo. I'm
yeah.
sorry, not Mario.
Well,
I'm sorry.
and she
That's
certainly,
how far we go back, man.
yeah, exactly. We were fighting Mario, but no,
Sorry, man.
and
I meant Andrew Cuomo. Yeah.
Kathy Hochul has a very cozy relationship with developers, and we saw her squeeze $500 million out of the Senecas and hand it over to a billionaire out here so they could build a football stadium, which who knows, I mean, when you're talking about this kind of development, who knows what may turn up on that site. They aren't like tearing the old stadium down and putting it on the same footprint. They're actually creating a new footprint. So we know that she is very much in the pocket of of major developers. So I mean, but regardless, if both houses pass this thing, if both sides of the state legislature pass this thing, it is it's pretty remarkable that she is either intentionally or unintentionally ignoring this legislation.
Well, that's why we are pushing public support for this legislation. We received letters of support from the United Southeastern Tribes. That's USET.
Hmm.
We're seeking support from the National Congress of American Indians. We've got a petition online. We've got support from the forum, the New York State Justice Forum. We've got support from other universities, and we're really pushing forward with demonstrating the need. We are demonstrating that we have public support for this legislation, as well as the support of the legislature itself. We've asked Tim Kennedy to come on board. We've asked the Speaker of the Assembly to come on board. We've yet to hear from all of those with respect to this, and they tell us they're focused on the election now, but they will we'll start to work on these things afterwards. So we hope that's true. We don't know that's true, but we hope that's true. But we're continuing to campaign for support for the signage of this bill. New York is one of 3 states that doesn't have this type of protection. And we didn't reinvent the wheel, John. We looked at the legislation of all 47 states that do have some sort of graves protection, some sort of unmarked burial site protection. And we looked at states like Massachusetts and Florida and Washington State that have configurations similar to New York, major urban centers, suburban areas, and rural areas. And we modeled our legislation based upon what we know works. And those states have legislation for years, and it works. It works in those states, basically. And we we see that New York is definitely one of those that would this would work. It establishes a committee. The first thing it does is that it makes it a crime to dig up a grave and not report it. It's a misdemeanor. To dig up a grave and then remove it is a felony. To dig up a grave and desecrate it, and destroy it is also a felony. So that's the first thing that it does. The second thing that it does is that it establishes a committee which is comprised of all representatives from all the Native nations in New York State. Okay. So everybody, whether you're from Long Island or upstate or Western New York, everybody has the opportunity to be represented. And so if you establish that there's a cultural affiliation, then you take the lead in that area. If it's in Seneca territory, the Senecas will take the lead. If it's in Mohawk territory, the Mohawks will take the lead. If it's in Long Island territory, the Shinnecock and Unkechaug will take the lead on making a determination of what's the most appropriate thing to do in a particular situation. And third, final thing is, which I believe is so important, is if the state attorney general has the right to take action to seek an injunction against any further activity. The district attorney has the right to take action in the event of seek an injunction to prevent any further activity. But more importantly, the individual nation or the individual who can establish a genealogical connection to lineal descendant is called, can on its own, on their own, take action to prevent any further desecration of activity.
Well, and that's important because one of the biggest challenges in any kind of legal action is this idea of standing, and so it seems like they broadened that enough to where you or I, if we were somehow the first to be made aware of something, that we could take actions ourselves. Now, here's the thing that I want to be clear to people who are listening here. This doesn't mean that there can't be development. It just really means that there has to be a process that manages and handles respectfully the remains or the artifacts and that kind of stuff. I mean, I think the obviously naysayers would say, "Well, geez, there could be Indians on every square foot of this land." Yes, there probably has been, but the point isn't to stop any development. I mean, and we could get into a whole debate on what is progress and what isn't progress. But in this situation, we're just saying there needs to be proper notifications. There needs to be and there has to be protocols that are followed, and those protocols may vary nation to nation. And that's kind of what you're spelling out with whomever takes lead on some of this stuff. But I think it's important that people realize that this isn't just an effort for us to take shots at developers. It's about holding them accountable.
It's about joining the rest of the civilized world and be able to protect funerary remains and objects.
Well, there's that too.
That are
yeah,
that are obviously something that needs to be protected. It's not viewed as an infringement on development rights. It's viewed as a protection against those things that we hold sacred. The legislation itself says if we are a society of people that bury their dead in a ceremony, if we are that people, then we need to protect those that have been buried.
Right.
It's a simple. I mean, it's just so fundamentally clear as what we need to do that it is, like you say, John, a no-brainer.
Yeah.
If we are those people, then we need to protect our dead.
Well, and
so this legislation does that.
And look, we would presume to counter, some of the abuses that our buried ancestors have encountered by saying that we should be able to build an Arlington cemetery or any one of the church cemeteries that exists, across the state. There's some that are very prominently featured, in the New York City area. We wouldn't be so presumptuous or disrespectful to say, well, if you're going to do that to us, then we get to do that. No, it's not even that. Sometimes it's about making the analogy so people can understand. While we think it would be absurd to do something on your grave sites, we think that the vast public has to let this seem as absurd to them as it would if the shoe was on the other foot.
And we know that they were very careful. The non-native colonists and the white folks were very careful about making sure their dead were marked clearly and preserved and protected, and stones put up and fences and caretakers were made. There was one example up in north of Albany where the Schuyler family, and we know who they are,
Mm-hmm.
they had their burial site fully protected and fully cared for. And just 100 yards from that, they dug up a mass burial of African American slaves that the Schuyler family had, and their bodies were their burials were unmarked,
Mm.
and their burials were desecrated.
Yeah.
So it's just another example that how, although we profess to hold these sites sacred, we only do that for a limited number of people, and that's why this law is necessary, because it protects along the full spectrum of people that are involved in this.
Well, and it is
So,
pretty remarkable that New York is so far behind the rest of the United States. I mean, the fact that they're only one of three states that don't have such protections is that's a whole nother level of absurdity when it comes right down to it. I mean, New York likes to think of itself as such a progressive state, and yet this is. I mean, there's no other way. And I know people take offense to when they say I play the race card, but there's no other way to describe the distinction with how we are treated in many of these regards, as opposed to how others are treated. And and especially look, I talked about it just last week when I was talking about the residential school issues. I dare somebody to show me one Native person who has received one of those $1 million settlements that some little white boy who was molested by a priest has received. And the state has opened up all kinds of laws to and extended the statute of limitations for people to bring these charges against abusive priests. But we still haven't begun to address the abuses, including sexual abuse, that Native children had to endure at the hands of these church-run, state and federal funded schools.
well, I I was talking to somebody from Ontario, and where they in Canada, they they did have what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now, for whatever criticisms, and there may be some founded criticisms with respect to what that how that was handled, at least you had an attempt at reconciliation. At least you had an attempt at least making a determination of who was involved in that process, and there was some levels of attempt at compensation. The
Yeah,
United
and
States
I'm just saying
completely ignored that.
if you compare it to to some of some of these plaintiffs that are bringing charges against the Catholic Church, it's not even close. And of course, most of the settlement on the Canadian side has been with the Canadian government and their role. The church has still not
Canadian
accepted.
government, right?
It hasn't accepted
Right.
any responsibility. Even the Pope going to Canada, a month ago, he didn't apologize on behalf of the church, the role that the Catholic Church played. He apologized that people who worked for the church. I mean, he made it sound like we apologize if somebody did something wrong. Not They weren't apologizing for the role the Catholic Church has played in everything from the doctrine of Christian discovery to this idea that our people needed to be converted and needed to be forced into this religious conversion. I mean, that wasn't dreamt up by politicians alone in the United States and Canada. This is something that the church had been doing. I mean, we talk about residential schools having existed for 150 years. The first piece of legislation on the U.S. side was in 1819, which was the Civilization Act, and it supported a couple of these church schools. It wouldn't be till another 40 years later that the federal government would go all in with this idea of schools that would mandate children be ripped from their families and placed in these things. And the other thing is that they also are quick to say, well, yeah, but we ended that in 1976 with the, and they claim that it ended with ICWA. But the fact of the matter is, residential schools existed for several decades after that, and well into, past the 2000s, because they just weren't being ripped from their families in the same way. The placement was handled differently after in the 1970s. But residential schools have existed for a long time, and I think that there does have to be an acknowledgement beyond this idea of reconciliation. There has to be truth that really analyzes the broad scope of what happened there, and you can't have reconciliation without restoration. We lost lands, we lost population, but we also lost autonomy. And the fact that we're still fighting for this thing, and again, when I think about this piece of legislation that does not pigeonhole us so much when it comes to being able to bring one of these actions. I think the broadening who has standing to bring this stuff is really important here. And again, I can't, I can't wrap my head around why Kathy Hochul would resist signing this thing, and other than her playing, I don't know, playing dumb on this thing, like she's somehow not aware of it or something.
Well, our process and our responsibility, John, is to make her fully aware of the import of the legislation and how significant it is, and to compel her to sign that.
Do you know who sponsored the bill originally? Who was the initial sponsors?
In the assembly, it was a fellow down here, downstate, who's been involved in this for over 20 years, and it was I just got just lost it. Hold on, let me grab the bill a second.
Because we even saw a couple of legislators that had initiated an attempt at doing a statewide ban on the mascot, the native mascot stuff, and that kind of died, in the legislature, because these things that should not be controversial at all should be easy asks, easy lifts, and again. This is about them regulating their own people. I can't emphasize this enough. Even though we may have standing to bring these actions, it's mostly about holding the governor and the legislature holding their own people accountable for these things that they're crimes. I mean, whether they've been identified as such or not, these are crimes.
So Assemblyman Engelbright, from Long Island, is a primary sponsor of the legislation in the Assembly, and he has been trying to get this legislation through for quite some time. And the bill had gone through a number of different changes based upon writing it appropriately so that it would be able to be palatable to the entire Assembly. And that's why we use the models of other states as a way in which to say this works there and it should work as well here. And in the Senate, it was Senator Comrie from New York City who was the primary sponsor in the Senate. The co-sponsor was Senator Scott from Long Island, and there was also in the Assembly was Fred Thiel from the Assembly. They were primary sponsors and co-sponsors of this legislation. But once we got it rolling, a lot of people came on board, John. It was just so common sense for them to make this effort, and a lot of people wanted to jump on board. In Western New York, and Tim Kennedy from the Senate. We got Judge Montour wrote a letter of support from the forum. And as you know, he was just recently appointed to the 4th Department. And he helped out quite a bit. And Judge Gonzalez from the 1st Department came on board big time. and a number of other different judges and people in support because they understand how important it is as judges, how important it is that this legislation be dealt with appropriately. So they came on board in support of that. And I can say that it is okay for them to come out in support of legislation because they're performing an understanding of where the gaps are in enforcement and in legislative action. So they understand that as well as anybody else because they have to rule on this stuff. You know?
Right, and it only makes sense. I mean, again, this is a justice issue, so I mean, it does make sense that that judges are have stepped up and weighed in, and you know, and again, some of these guys we've known a number of years, and it's good to see some of them stepping up. I guess you know I still come back to the same place though. Um, New York should be embarrassed to have
Should be.
this hanging out there for so long. And you know, we'll make the noise, and we'll make sure that Kathy Hochul will not be able to claim ignorance about this, and that she's going to have to make a decision one way or the other. And if she, you know, if she tries to block it, I mean, if it went through so easily, there's probably enough to sustain, you know, or override a veto if that were the case. But I can't imagine her wanting to
Except,
be in that situation either.
except that the legislature is not in session. You can't veto legislation unless they are in session.
Hmm.
And it's unlikely that they would be in session for the rest of the year.
Sure.
So so what would it be? What could occur is that you could have what's called a pocket veto. She could just do nothing. And as of December 31st, 2022, the legislation would simply expire and it would be and you would have to start the process all over again in January 1st. So, and it is unlikely, as a practical matter, for a democratically run legislature to override a veto of a Democratic governor.
Yeah.
It's just not done, John.
Yeah.
So you know that.
No,
So
that's again the
the
politics, not necessarily the justice, right?
well, you know, I had a teacher that told me lovers of the law and sausage should not see how either one is made. So you know, we're at that stage where we're trying to make some law here. So
Yeah, yeah, no,
the
and
important thing though is that we let people know that they have an opportunity to have their voice heard. You know, you may not participate directly in the electoral process or in the political process, but your voice is being heard. And that's why I'm asking for you to let your listeners, let your audience know that the voice is important. Your voice is important to be heard. Whether or not you are participating in a Republican or Democratic Party, we need to we need to join with the rest of the union and protect those who don't have a voice, who can't speak for themselves.
well, and
We
that's
need to
clearly the
speak
people who have
for them.
passed. I mean, and this is where it becomes so problematic because it has been so hard for us to gain traction for our concerns, and that's why so many of these issues hang out there for year after year, decade after decade, century after century, and I think it's important that that we hold these folks accountable. And look, I will not only use the platforms that I have, but you know, I do a lot of direct engagement. You know, you know that pretty well over the years. I've made my trips to Albany, and I've gone to, you know, hey, Kathy Hochul lives out here in Western New York, so if I've got to beat her up in the media out here, I'll do that as well. I think this stuff is really important, and you know when these, you know, when she tries to play the quaint hometown girl out here in Western New York, I just think that she's got to be held accountable for some of the stuff that that frankly is a little distasteful, and you know, and I think her cozy relationship with developers, and you know, and including the cozy relationship her husband has with them is one of the things. This would be, like I said, when I say it's a no brainer, this would be an easy lift for her to do without having to, you know, I don't know, sacrifice much. This is just, you know, and especially when you consider her track record with Native people is not great. this would be just one of those, little olive branches that she could throw out there, so she doesn't necessarily have to come across as such a tyrant when it comes to Native issues.
Well, I think that if she wants to repair the relationship with the Native people, this is a good start.
I think so too, and I think this
Yes,
is
this is everybody. I've spoken to people from Seneca Nation, Akwesasne, Onondaga. Everybody's on board with this. I remember a time way back when New York State wanted to establish a um, um, a registry of sacred sites, and there was opposition to that back then because there was concern that those sacred sites would be desecrated, especially those sites that are not on our territories where we don't have direct control and possession. And I kind of supported that because we had no way to protect them.
yeah.
So you wouldn't want to let people know where they are if you couldn't protect those locations.
Yeah, if there was nothing,
This,
especially if there was nothing in place, if there
nothing in
wasn't even
place.
laws in place to protect them. No, absolutely, and we know, look, like I said, the history of looting um, our 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 buried remains is something that is, again, it's one of those ugly chapters of American history.
John, I have been involved in the graves repatriation on Long Island for a long time. And during this post-COVID period, we've probably reburied over 200 human bodies since December 2020.
Hmm.
I can tell you that of the over 200 bodies that we've reburied, there have been no funerary objects reburied with them.
Well, that tells you
Now, you
something.
and I both know that we don't bury our dead naked.
Yeah.
So what happened to those? And you look at the provenance. These are institutions, major institutions that have enormous collections. Like you said, Museum of American Indian, American Museum of Natural History, the Peabody Museum, major institutions in this country, who all of a sudden, when it comes to the provenance of Native remains, they have an amnesia.
Yeah.
So I've done this for a long time, and they just don't they just don't have memory. They have institutional amnesia
Yeah.
when it comes to what happened to funerary objects of Native people.
Yeah, yeah. No,
So
I
yeah,
don't. It's not a
it's pretty
coincidence. It's certainly not a coincidence, and I think it's really important that the public become more aware of this. Because I think, again, I know we don't have a whole lot of choices, and the general public sure doesn't have a whole lot of choices in elevating champions in their political system. So oftentimes, whoever's there, they have to be guided with a stern hand. Look, these people are not. They're not elected to be leaders. They really aren't. I mean, they actually use a phrase that we, as not just Haudenosaunee but Algonquin people, have used, that they are servants. They are put in, you yourself. You sit in a position as a servant of your people, not necessarily as, some the leader and champion of your people, but as somebody who serves your people. And that service is what really marks what I would mark what you would call, leadership. So I think it's really important that people remember that Kathy Hochul is a servant of the people, and so the people have to hold her accountable.
so I remember talking to one of the nation leaders in New York, who shall go nameless. They're saying with change comes opportunity. And so when you look at Kathy Hochul was thrust into a position inadvertently, and so she has the opportunity for change. And so because she has that opportunity for change, she has an opportunity to make a statement. And I believe this is one of the ways that she can do that.
Well, let's
So
hold her to it,
let's
Harry.
hold let's hold it. Let's hope that's true.
I want to thank you so much for joining me on the program. I look forward to having you return, and maybe we can talk about this in the past the next time you join me about the legislation that was signed, and that'll be the hope that we have. I want to thank you so much for joining me. It's always great to have you. And look, now that we're a little bit post-COVID, maybe I'll get a chance to make it down to your neck of the woods, and we can break
Well,
some bread together.
we always enjoy you come down here. We can get some of that shellfish that you've been talking about there.
That sounds great, Harry.
But
I want
enjoy
to thank you
your
so much.
time, John.
All right, you take care of
And
yourself.
you too. Be well.
Hold on.
Oh.
All right, that's Harry Wallace, who is the principal chief of the Unkechaug Nation in Puspatuk on Long Island, and I want to thank him for joining us and going through this. And you can find the link to the petition on my pages to push Kathy Hochul to cease her ignoring this legislation and to have her go ahead and sign that legislation. That's about it. Hey, look, again, I want to thank the WPFW and WBAI for providing this platform, and I hope the good listeners of these stations stay engaged. And if you're in New York, or even if you're not in New York, by all means, sign the petition and let's press Kathy Hochul to do what is right in this situation. We greatly appreciate it. I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio.